So unfortunately, the Mac Mini is gone, and I'll explain why in a little bit. But long story short, the Mac Mini had to go and I replaced it with a base model Mac Studio, and here's why. If you're new to the channel, then make sure you're subscribed and hit that bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos. That's if you obviously enjoy this type of content. Those of you that are already subscribed know what my experience with Apple Silicon has been like in the form of the Mac Mini that I bought last year. I did a whole video and I will link it up here. M1 launched on Apple computers, but it always felt like low-end hardware for mainstream users that want a snappy and efficient Mac and don't necessarily need high-end performance. I skipped that one initially because honestly the original M1 chip was limited at 16 gigabytes of unified memory, which was a letdown for more demanding workflows. The fact that Apple's new system on a chip design shared the memory across the graphics and CPU almost felt like the higher spec models with 16 gigabytes in real-world use effectively had 8 gigabytes of GPU memory and 8 gigabytes of usable RAM for application and programs. Now of course, if you never use any graphics intensive applications, then you'll absolutely be fine, and from my experience with the M1 Mac Mini, that was the case. However, as time went by, I began to notice just how much memory pressure there was even when running idle with daily applications open like Chrome, Safari, Mail, and a few Word or Excel documents. My Mac Mini was a M1 with 16 gigabytes of unified memory and 256 gigs of SSD storage. It ran super fast, and really I never had any issues with it until I started having display flicker issues. To make a very long story short, I would get terrible display flicker continuously both through HDMI and USB-C. I took it back to Apple a couple of times, and between logic board replacements and even entire unit replacements, this issue simply could not be fixed. It turns out that M1 or Apple Silicon display compatibility is an actual thing that you have to do research about before you buy these new systems. My Dell 32-inch 4K monitor seems to have severe compatibility issues with Apple Silicon. So in the end, it wasn't the Mac Mini's fault at all. However, the final deciding factor came when one day I tried to launch Lightroom and Photoshop with Final Cut rendering in the background, and the Mac Mini simply couldn't do it. It completely choked and would literally force close both Lightroom and Photoshop. Couldn't even get past the Adobe launch screen. Mind you, something that my 2013 Intel-based MacBook Pro was able to do. I was disappointed because from a performance perspective, the M1 was always capable enough for all my needs, but the memory limitations were crippling for my workflow. So Mac Mini had to go, and I've recently picked up a base model Mac Studio with a 10-core M1 Max, 24-core GPU, and 32 gigs of unified memory, and a 512 gig SSD. So literally the lowest spec Mac Studio money can buy. To my surprise, the overall experience hasn't been different at all. Day-to-day use with daily applications is pretty much identical to the Mac Mini. And really, the only times I'm able to notice the performance improvement are when I'm using Adobe software like Lightroom or Photoshop, and when I'm rendering videos in Final Cut. Also when I'm running these programs simultaneously, which of course the Mac Mini couldn't even do. The M2 chip recently joined the lineup, promising about a 20% performance jump over its predecessor, the M1. Most notably was the memory improvement, now offering up to 24 gigabytes of unified memory. The M2 launched prior to me buying my Mac Studio, and it really got me thinking. To wait for the M2 Mac Mini or to just splurge a little more dollars on a Mac Studio? I started weighing in my options, and judging from my experience with the M1 Mac Mini, I came to the following conclusions. A top-end M2 Mac Mini with 24 gigabytes of unified memory will not be as inexpensive as you think. Well, that's relative to a base model Mac Studio. I know this because right now, a M1 Mac Mini with a 512GB SSD and 16 gigabytes of unified memory goes for $1,100 US, which is $900 cheaper than the entry-level Mac Studio. When the M2 Mac Mini finally does launch, it will fit within the $1,100 to $2,000 range. I suspect it will line up just north of the $1,500 mark, judging from just how Apple has priced their other products. And with a M2 MacBook Air with 24 gigabytes of unified memory and 512 gigabytes of SSD, which we can buy right now for $1,900, I strongly believe my prediction will be spot on. So what that means is that in terms of cost per performance, the top-end M2 Mac Mini will actually be more expensive than the base model M1 Max Mac Studio. You will likely have to pay about $400 more or less for the Mac Studio, but for that you'll get so much more in the form of a more robust media engine for video processing, 8 GB more of unified memory, which does come in handy with this unified architecture, especially for demanding workflows as mentioned earlier in the video, a much faster 10 versus 8 core CPU, and a 24 versus 10 core GPU that is more than twice as big, with 4 times the memory bandwidth of the M2. This means that you can roughly expect about 2.5 times the performance of the M2's GPU in the M1 Max. And while the neural engine on the M2 is faster than the one of the M1 Max, the M1 Max is in a completely different league and will significantly outpace the M2 in every other measurable way. You will also get support for more displays on the Mac Studio with 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 USB-A ports, a further 2 USB-C ports, and a UHS 2 SD card slot on the front. All this versus 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 USB-A ports, and no SD card slot at all. Now of course the M2 Mac Mini might come with more ports than its predecessor, but one thing is for sure, you simply won't get as many of them as you get on the Mac Studio. So ultimately that becomes the dilemma, and personally for me it was a no-brainer because the M1 Max Mac Studio is a far more superior machine and one that will be far more future-proof than the M2 Mac Mini, and that's if we ever get one. Now if the price difference, no matter how small or big it may be, is a big issue for you, then of course go for the M2 Mac Mini. However, this is a product that you won't even be able to get right now. And if you really aren't willing to spend those extra dollars, then you're probably just better off going with the 16 GB M1 Mac Mini, which is more affordable and of course available right now. Just looking at the timeline for Apple's transition to Apple Silicon, it doesn't really look like a redesigned or top-end Mac Mini is a priority for them right now. It will probably just disrupt their product lineup more than anything else. As a whole, the entire Apple Silicon lineup is already so robust that even at the lower end, you're pretty much getting 80 to 90% of the overall experience for daily tasks, whether you're using the M1 Ultra or an entry-level M1 in something like a MacBook Air. And in some respect, I was actually a little disappointed in the lack of any noticeable performance improvement during my day-to-day tasks with the M1 Max over the original M1. However, what I did get in the form of an M1 Max Mac Studio is a Mac that is far more future-proof and will stand the test of time for many years to come, even in a high-end demanding workflow. So if you're one of the people waiting on the top-end Apple Silicon Mac Mini, then I strongly suggest you just bump up to the Mac Studio. No matter how you look at it, even if Apple decides to go with the M1 Pro for the top-end Mac Mini, that chip is still quite a bit slower than the M1 Max. And ultimately, you're giving up a lot in just what the form factor alone of the Mac Studio offers you in terms of ports and multiple display support. Don't wait for the M2 Mac Mini, just get the base model Mac Studio, or if that is outside your budget, then just go with a 16 GB M1 Mac Mini. Either way, you certainly will not be disappointed. And if you do decide to follow my advice, you'll be able to get a system that you can actually buy right now and just get started doing work, whether that's creating or whatever it is that you do. Just the time alone you lose waiting on the M2 Mac Mini will seriously affect your productivity. Trust me, I know this because I'm one of the people that held back on the M1 Mac Mini for so long in the hopes that the higher end model was right around the corner. It wasn't. And ultimately, I ended up buying the same M1 Mac Mini I had passed on a year prior simply because I just couldn't wait any longer. I lost so many months of productive time when I could have just made a bold decision and gotten on with it and created more and moved on with my life. Thanks for watching, and I hope that this video has been helpful to you. If you aren't already subscribed to the channel, then make sure that you do. It's completely free. And make sure to hit that bell icon to get notified when I upload new videos. I'll catch you folks in the next one.